The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the one-room schoolhouse in Seattle, Washington Territory. And Octavia Wright knew she had at least 2 hours of hard work ahead of her before she could return to her small rented room above the general store. She was 22 years old, unmarried and grateful beyond measure for this position that allowed her to earn an honest living in this rough frontier town in the year 1883. Most women her age were already wives and mothers, but Octavia had chosen a different path, one that began each morning before dawn and ended long after the children had scattered to their homes across the muddy streets and rolling hills surrounding the growing settlement. She stepped inside the schoolhouse, her worn leather shoes clicking softly against the wooden floor as she surveyed the chaos left behind by 37 energetic students. Slates were scattered across desks, chalk dust covered nearly every surface, and someone had spilled ink across the back table where the older boys practiced their penmanship. The pot-bellied stove in the corner still radiated warmth, though the fire had burned down to embers. Octavia set down her cleaning basket and removed her shawl, draping it carefully over the back of her desk chair, before rolling up the sleeves of her simple gray dress. She had been cleaning the schoolhouse every evening for the past 3 months since she had arrived in Seattle, and in that time, she had developed a routine that made the work manageable if not easy. First, she would collect all the slates and stack them neatly on the shelves. Then she would sweep the floor, moving methodically from the back of the room toward the door. After that came the dusting, the washing of the windows when necessary, and the careful attention to any spills or stains that needed immediate treatment. Finally, she would prepare the room for the next day, arranging the readers and primers, checking the supply of chalk, and making sure everything was in its proper place. Tonight, however, she had barely begun collecting the slates when she heard boots on the wooden steps outside. Her heart quickened with alarm. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, close enough to be considered civilized but far enough that she often felt isolated during these evening hours. She turned toward the door, her hands gripping a slate perhaps a bit too tightly, ready to defend herself if necessary. The door swung open, and a tall man stepped inside, removing his dusty hat as he did so. Octavia recognized him immediately, though they had never spoken. Everyone in Seattle knew Dalton Zimmerman, the cowboy who worked at the largest cattle ranch 20 miles outside of town. He came into Seattle once a week for supplies, and she had seen him ride past the schoolhouse on numerous occasions, always astride a magnificent chestnut mare, always looking as though he belonged to the wild land itself rather than any town or settlement. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of strong coffee. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. He stood in the doorway now, hat in hand, looking almost sheepish. "Miss Wright," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fill the small schoolhouse. "I hope I am not startling you." "You did startle me, Mr. Zimmerman," Octavia replied, setting down the slate and straightening her spine. "It is not customary for people to arrive at the schoolhouse after hours." "No, I suppose it is not." He stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him to keep out the evening chill. "I was riding past, and I saw the lamp burning." "I have ridden past many evenings and seen that lamp burning, and it occurred to me that you must be here quite late each night, doing work that most folks never see or appreciate." Octavia felt a flush creep up her neck. She was unaccustomed to such observations, particularly from men. "The schoolhouse must be maintained, Mr. Zimmerman. The school board hired me to teach, and maintaining a clean, orderly environment is part of that responsibility. They hired you to teach, Dalton said, taking another step closer. Do they pay you extra for all this cleaning? The question was direct, and Octavia appreciated that even as she felt uncomfortable admitting the truth. No, they do not. But the work must be done regardless, and there is no one else to do it. Dalton nodded slowly, looking around the room with new eyes. That does not seem quite fair, if you will pardon my saying so. Fairness is a luxury, Mr. Zimmerman. I am grateful to have employment at all. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes. Would you allow me to help you? Octavia blinked in surprise. Help me? Why would you want to do that? Because I can see you have hours of work ahead of you, and I have nothing but time this evening. My boss gave me a few days off while he takes some cattle to market. I am staying at the boarding house in town, and I have no obligations pulling me elsewhere. He gestured around the room. Besides, I never had much schooling myself. Spent my youth working ranches with my father. It seems right, somehow, to give something back to a place of learning. Octavia studied him carefully, searching for any sign of ulterior motive. She had learned to be cautious around men, particularly in a town where women were outnumbered 3-1. But Dalton's face showed only earnest sincerity, and something in her heart told her to trust him. Very well, she said slowly. If you truly wish to help, I would be grateful for the assistance. I warn you, it is not glamorous work. A smile broke across Dalton's face, transforming his weathered features into something approaching handsome. Miss Wright, I shovel manure for a living. I reckon I can handle a bit of schoolhouse cleaning. And so began an unlikely partnership. Octavia directed Dalton to begin collecting the scattered primers and readers, while she continued gathering the slates. They worked in companionable silence at first, the only sounds the shuffle of their feet and the occasional clink of slate against slate. Octavia found herself sneaking glances at the tall cowboy as he moved carefully through the room, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he handled the small books. You must be careful with that one, she said, noticing him pick up a particularly worn reader. The binding is coming loose, and it is one of only 2 copies we have for the advanced students. Dalton immediately adjusted his grip, cradling the book as though it were made of glass. I will be more careful. I am sorry. You did nothing wrong, Octavia assured him. I only wanted you to know. He set the book gently on the shelf she indicated, then turned to face her. What made you become a teacher, Miss Wright, if you do not mind my asking? Octavia considered the question as she wiped chalk dust from a desk. My mother was a teacher back in Ohio, where I grew up. She taught me that education was the most powerful tool a person could possess, regardless of their station in life. When she passed away 3 years ago, I decided to honor her memory by following in her profession. I am sorry for your loss, Dalton said quietly. What brought you all the way to Washington Territory? Opportunity, Octavia replied. There are more teaching positions available in the frontier territories than in the established states. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Seattle, I applied immediately. I sold everything I owned to pay for the journey west. Dalton resumed his work, collecting scattered pieces of chalk from the floor. That took considerable courage, or considerable desperation, Octavia said with a slight smile. I was not entirely certain which it was at the time. Now that I have been here a few months, I think perhaps it was both. They continued working, and Octavia found herself sharing more than she had intended. She told Dalton about the challenges of teaching students whose ages ranged from 5 to 16 in a single room. She described the difficulty of maintaining discipline when the older boys were nearly grown men, who often resented being confined indoors when they could be working and earning wages. She explained her methods for teaching reading and arithmetic, her voice growing animated as she discussed the rewards of seeing a child's face light up with understanding. Dalton listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and offering observations that surprised her with their insight. For a man who claimed to have little formal education, he clearly possessed intelligence and curiosity. "My father taught me to read," Dalton said as he helped her move the benches so she could sweep beneath them. He said a man who could not read was at the mercy of those who could, and he refused to raise a son who was at anyone's mercy. "We did not have proper schooling where I grew up in Montana, but he made sure I knew my letters and could cipher well enough to keep from being cheated." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Octavia said. "He was," Dalton agreed, and something in his tone told her that his father was no longer alive. She did not press for details. By the time they had finished sweeping, dusting, and arranging the room for the next day, nearly 2 hours had passed. Octavia stood in the doorway, surveying their work with satisfaction. The schoolhouse gleamed in the lamplight, every surface clean, every book and slate in its proper place. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman," she said sincerely. "Your help has been invaluable. What would have taken me until well past dark is now complete while the sun has barely set." Dalton replaced his hat on his head and smiled. "It was my pleasure, Miss Wright. I enjoyed our conversation, and I confess I feel a sense of satisfaction looking at this clean room, knowing I had a hand in preparing it for tomorrow's students." They walked together down the schoolhouse steps and into the cooling evening air. Seattle was growing rapidly, with new buildings seeming to appear overnight, but it still retained the rough character of a frontier town. The streets were unpaved and turned to thick mud whenever it rained, which was often. Wooden sidewalks connected the main businesses, and oil lamps were beginning to glow in windows as families settled in for the evening. "May I walk you to wherever you are staying?" Dalton asked. "It is getting dark, and I would feel better knowing you arrived safely." Octavia hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I rent a room above the general store. It is not far." They walked slowly through the streets, their pace leisurely despite the growing darkness. Octavia found herself reluctant for the evening to end, though she could not quite explain why. She had enjoyed Dalton's company more than she had anticipated, and his help had been genuinely useful rather than the hindrance she might have expected. "Will you be returning to the ranch soon?" she asked as they approached the general store. "In 3 days," Dalton replied. "But I was wondering, Miss Wright, if you might allow me to help you again tomorrow evening. I found the work satisfying and your company even more so." Octavia felt her cheeks warm despite the cool air. "I would not want to impose on your time, Mr. Zimmerman." "It would not be an imposition," he assured her. "It would be a choice I make freely because I wish to make it." She studied his face in the fading light, seeing nothing but sincerity in his expression. "Then yes, I would welcome your help. The students can be quite enthusiastic in their destruction of order, and another pair of hands makes the work considerably easier." "Then I will see you tomorrow evening," Dalton said, touching the brim of his hat. "Good night, Miss Wright." "Good night, Mr. Zimmerman." Octavia climbed the narrow stairs to her small room, her mind full of the unexpected turn her evening had taken. She prepared a simple supper of bread and cheese, then sat by her window, looking out over the darkening town. She could see the schoolhouse from her window, its white walls glowing faintly in the moonlight, and she thought about the tall cowboy who had offered his help so freely. The next day passed with its usual challenges and small triumphs. Octavia taught her students their lessons, refereed disputes, encouraged the struggling readers, and challenged the advanced students with more complex arithmetic. All day, however, she found her thoughts drifting to the evening ahead, wondering if Dalton would truly return, or if his offer had been merely a polite gesture he had no intention of keeping. When the last student finally departed and Octavia began her usual preparations for cleaning, she tried to tamp down her anticipation. She would not be disappointed if he failed to appear, she told herself. She had managed perfectly well on her own for 3 months and could continue to do so. But when she heard boots on the steps precisely at the same time as the previous evening, her heart leapt with undeniable pleasure. Dalton appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, that same slight smile on his weathered face. "Good evening, Miss Wright. I hope you do not mind my returning." "Not at all, Mr. Zimmerman," Octavia replied, unable to suppress her own smile. "In fact, I confess I was hoping you would." Something warm passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgment of mutual interest that neither was quite ready to name. They set to work with the easy familiarity of people who had performed these tasks together before, though in truth they had shared only one evening. As they worked, their conversation flowed more easily than the previous night. Dalton told her about his life on the ranch, describing the daily routines of cattle work with an eloquence that surprised her. He spoke of early mornings when frost covered the grass, of long days moving cattle across rolling hills, of nights spent under stars so numerous they seemed impossible. He described the satisfaction of hard physical labor, the bond between a man and his horse, the camaraderie among the ranch hands. "It is a hard life," he admitted as he washed the windows while Octavia swept. "Dangerous sometimes, too. I have seen men thrown from horses, trampled by cattle, caught in blizzards. But there is something about it that suits me. I like the simplicity of it, the way each day has clear purposes and clear rewards. You never wish for something more?" Octavia asked, pausing in her sweeping to look at him. "A family, perhaps, a home of your own," Dalton's hand stilled on the window. "I have wished for those things," he said quietly, "but ranch work does not lend itself easily to family life. The hours are long, the pay is modest, and the work takes a man away from home for days or weeks at a time. It has never seemed fair to ask a woman to accept that kind of life. Perhaps you should let the woman decide what she is willing to accept," Octavia suggested gently. He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Perhaps I should," he agreed. They finished the cleaning in thoughtful silence, and when Dalton walked her home that evening, their conversation turned to lighter topics. He made her laugh with stories of mishaps on the ranch, of ornery cattle and stubborn horses, of the cook who could not make coffee without burning it and the foreman who sang opera while he worked, despite having never heard a real opera in his life. Octavia found herself sharing her own stories, describing the antics of her students, the challenges of teaching children who spoke English as a second language, having recently immigrated with their families from various countries. She talked about the rewards of watching understanding dawn in a child's eyes, of receiving a carefully drawn picture as a gift, of knowing that she was making a difference in these young lives. "You speak of your students with such devotion," Dalton observed as they reached the general store. "It is clear that teaching is not merely a job for you but a calling." "It is," Octavia agreed, "though I confess there are days when the challenges seem overwhelming, days when I question whether I am truly making any difference at all." "You are making a difference," Dalton said with conviction. "Those children are learning not only reading and arithmetic, but also the value of dedication and hard work. They see you there every morning, prepared and ready. They may not appreciate it now, but someday they will understand what a gift you gave them." His words touched her deeply, and Octavia felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "I needed to hear that. Then I am glad I said it." Dalton hesitated, then added, "May I help you again tomorrow? I would like that very much." And so a pattern established itself. For the next 2 evenings, Dalton appeared at the schoolhouse just as Octavia was preparing to begin her cleaning. They worked together, their coordination improving with each passing night, their conversation growing deeper and more personal. Octavia learned about Dalton's childhood in Montana, about the mother he had lost to fever when he was 12, about the father who had raised him with a firm hand and a loving heart, until he too had passed away 5 years ago. She learned about Dalton's dreams of someday owning his own small ranch, of raising fine horses, of building something lasting. Dalton learned about Octavia's grief over her mother's death, about her complicated relationship with her father who had remarried quickly, and seemed content to forget his first wife and the daughter who reminded him of her. He learned about her love of books, her passion for teaching, her hope that she might someday write her own primer that would be better suited to the needs of frontier students. On the 4th evening, Dalton's last before returning to the ranch, they finished their work earlier than usual. The schoolhouse gleamed around them, and neither seemed eager to leave. "I will miss this," Dalton said, leaning against a desk and looking around the room. "These past few evenings have been among the most pleasant I have known in a long while." "I will miss it too," Octavia admitted. She stood near her own desk, her hands folded in front of her, suddenly feeling shy. "Will you return to Seattle again soon?" "I come to town every week for supplies," Dalton said. "Usually on Saturdays, but I could come on other days as well if I had a reason." "Would helping me clean the schoolhouse be reason enough?" Dalton pushed away from the desk and crossed the room until he stood directly in front of her. "Miss Wright, I hope you know that my interest in helping you clean this schoolhouse has very little to do with the cleaning itself, and a great deal to do with spending time in your company." Octavia's heart hammered in her chest. "I had hoped that might be the case, Mr. Zimmerman. I find myself looking forward to these evenings not because the work is easier with help, though it is, but because I enjoy talking with you. I enjoy hearing about your life and your dreams. I enjoy the way you listen when I speak about mine." "Octavia," Dalton said, using her given name for the first time. "May I call you Octavia?" "Yes," she whispered, "and I should like to call you Dalton if I may. I would like that very much." He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished, and took one of her hands in both of his. His hands were rough and calloused, bearing the marks of hard labor, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "I know we have known each other only a few days, but I feel as though I have been waiting to meet you my entire life. You are unlike any woman I have ever known. Your intelligence, your dedication, your kindness. You have shown me what true devotion looks like, the way you care for your students and this schoolhouse even when no one is watching or appreciating your efforts." "You were watching," Octavia said. "You appreciated it." "I was, and I did, because I recognized something of value when I saw it." Dalton paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I would like to court you properly, Octavia, if you would allow it. I know my circumstances are not ideal. I am a ranch hand with modest means and uncertain prospects. But I am hardworking and honest, and I can promise you that I would always treat you with the respect and admiration you deserve." Octavia felt as though her heart might burst from her chest. She had not expected this, had not dared to hope that these few evenings might lead to something more. "I would be honored to have you court me, Dalton. Your circumstances do not concern me. I too have modest means and uncertain prospects. What matters to me is that you are a good man with a kind heart, and that you have shown me more consideration in 4 evenings than most men show in a lifetime." Dalton's face broke into a brilliant smile. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture that was both courtly and tender. "Then I will return next week, and we will continue as we have been if that suits you." "It suits me perfectly." They walked slowly to the general store that evening, their hands clasped together, neither speaking much but both feeling the weight and wonder of this new understanding between them. When they reached her door, Dalton bid her good night with another kiss to her hand and a promise to return the following week. Octavia climbed to her room feeling as though she were floating. She had come to Washington Territory seeking opportunity, but she had found something far more precious. She had found a man who saw her, truly saw her, not just as a teacher or a woman alone, but as a person of value and substance. A man who had taken the time to help her with the mundane work of cleaning a schoolhouse and who had somehow learned about devotion in the process. The week that followed passed with agonizing slowness. Octavia threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy, but every evening as she cleaned the schoolhouse alone, she thought of Dalton and counted the days until his return. She wondered if he was thinking of her as well, if he was counting the days as she was. On Saturday afternoon, she took extra care with her appearance, pinning her honey-colored hair more carefully than usual and wearing her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. She told herself she was being foolish, that Dalton would not care what she wore, but she wanted to look her best for him nonetheless. When the last student left that afternoon, Octavia's hands trembled slightly as she prepared for the evening's work. Would Dalton truly come? Had she read too much into their conversations and his declaration of interest? Perhaps, in the cold light of the ranch and his regular life, he had reconsidered his hasty words. But when she heard familiar boots on the steps, all her doubts evaporated. Dalton appeared in the doorway and his face lit up when he saw her. "Octavia," he said, removing his hat, "I have thought of nothing but this moment all week." "Nor have I," she admitted, crossing the room to meet him. They stood close together, closer than propriety might dictate, and Octavia could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She could smell leather and horses and the clean scent of soap, and she thought she had never encountered a more appealing combination. "I brought you something," Dalton said, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "It is not much, but I saw it in town and thought of you." Octavia took the package with wondering hands and carefully untied the string. Inside was a small leather-bound journal with blank pages, perfect for writing. "Oh, Dalton," she breathed. "It is beautiful, thank you. You mentioned wanting to write your own primer," he said. "I thought perhaps you could use this to begin drafting your ideas." "It is perfect," Octavia said, clutching the journal to her chest. "I will treasure it always." They set to work cleaning the schoolhouse, but the atmosphere was different now. There was an ease between them born of their mutual understanding, a comfort that allowed for both conversation and companionable silence. When their hands brushed accidentally, they no longer pulled away immediately, but allowed the touch to linger. When their eyes met, they smiled at each other with a warmth that spoke of growing affection. "Tell me about your week," Octavia said as she organized the primers. "What have you been doing at the ranch?" Dalton described the work of moving cattle to new grazing lands, of mending fences and breaking a young horse to saddle. He told her about the satisfaction of seeing the foal he had been training finally accept a rider, about the beauty of sunrise over the mountains, about the simple pleasure of good food after a long day of hard work. "But through it all," he added, "I found myself thinking about you, wondering what you were doing, how your students were progressing, whether you were having to clean this whole schoolhouse by yourself each evening. I was, Octavia said, and I confess it seemed a lonelier task than it had before. You have spoiled me, Dalton. Now when I work alone, I miss having someone to talk to. Then I will have to make sure you do not have to work alone, Dalton said. I have spoken to my boss, and he has agreed to let me adjust my schedule so I can come to town more often. I will be here every Saturday and perhaps one evening during the week as well. Truly, Octavia asked, her heart soaring. Truly. I told him I was courting someone special, and he understood. He is a family man himself and knows the importance of making time for such things. They finished their work and walked out into the cool evening air. This time, instead of walking directly to the general store, they took a longer route that led them past some of the newer buildings and toward the waterfront where the smell of salt and fish hung in the air. Seattle was changing rapidly, growing from a rough logging town into something more substantial, and walking through its streets felt like watching history unfold. You think you will stay in Seattle? Dalton asked as they walked. Or do you imagine moving somewhere else eventually? I have given it some thought, Octavia admitted. Seattle is growing, and I believe it has a promising future. But I confess, I sometimes dream of teaching in a smaller community, perhaps a town that is just being established. Somewhere I could truly make a lasting impact. Would you consider moving if the right opportunity presented itself? I suppose that would depend on the opportunity, Octavia said carefully, and on other factors as well. Dalton squeezed her hand gently. Such as whether you had a reason to stay or a reason to go, precisely. They walked in silence for a moment. Then Dalton said, The ranch where I work is a large operation, but there are smaller ranches and farms scattered throughout this region. Some of them have children who receive no schooling at all because they are too far from town. I have often thought it a shame that those children should grow up without learning to read and cipher properly. It is a shame, Octavia agreed. Every child deserves an education. What if someone were to establish a small school for those children? Perhaps in one of the growing settlements east of here. Would that be the kind of opportunity that might interest you? Octavia stopped walking and turned to face him. Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting? Dalton looked slightly nervous but determined. I am getting ahead of myself, I know. We have known each other only a short time. But I cannot help thinking about the future, Octavia. I cannot help imagining possibilities. I have some money saved, and I have been looking at land where I might start my own small horse ranch. There is a settlement about 30 miles from here where families are beginning to put down roots, and they have no school. I have thought that if I were to settle there, if I were to build a life there, it would be a place where someone like you could make a real difference. Someone like me. Octavia echoed. You specifically, Dalton clarified. I am speaking clumsily, but what I mean to say is that I am already imagining a future with you in it, Octavia. I know it is too soon to speak of such things directly, but I want you to know that my intentions are serious. I am not courting you casually. I am courting you with the hope that someday, if you find you care for me as I care for you, we might build a life together. Octavia felt tears spring to her eyes. I do care for you, Dalton. Perhaps I should not admit it so readily, but I do. These past weeks, knowing you were going to come help me, have been the happiest I have known in years. You have shown me what it means to have a partner, someone who sees work that needs doing and simply does it without expecting praise or recognition. You have shown me what devotion truly looks like. You showed me devotion first, Dalton said, reaching up to gently touch her cheek. I saw you here, evening after evening, caring for this schoolhouse and the students who would fill it the next day. I saw you giving of yourself without holding anything back, and it inspired me. It made me want to be the kind of man who could match that devotion, who could be worthy of it. You are worthy, Octavia whispered. You are more than worthy. They stood on the darkening street, lost in each other's eyes, and Octavia felt as though the rest of the world had fallen away. There was only this man, this moment, this feeling of rightness that settled deep in her bones. "May I kiss you?" Dalton asked softly. "Yes," Octavia breathed. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but she had no intention of doing so. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a kiss that spoke of respect and tenderness and the promise of more to come. Octavia's eyes fluttered closed, and she allowed herself to simply feel, to experience this moment of perfect connection. When they finally drew apart, both were smiling. "I should get you home before your reputation suffers," Dalton said reluctantly. "I suppose you should," Octavia agreed, though she made no move to step away from him. They walked the rest of the way to the general store hand in hand, neither speaking but both feeling the profound shift that had occurred between them. This was no longer simply courtship. This was the beginning of something deeper, something that would shape the rest of their lives. Over the following months, Dalton made good on his promise to visit Seattle more frequently. He came every Saturday without fail, and often one evening during the week as well. Sometimes he arrived early enough to observe Octavia teaching her students, and she could see the admiration in his eyes as he watched her work. Other times he arrived precisely at the end of the school day, ready to help with the cleaning and to spend whatever time they could together. They took walks through Seattle's growing streets, watched ships come and go from the harbor, and shared meals at the modest restaurant near the waterfront. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's thoughts on politics and religion, on literature and philosophy, on the future of the territories and the expansion of the railroad. Dalton told Octavia about his dreams of starting a horse ranch, describing in detail the kind of operation he hoped to build. He wanted to breed and train quality horses, he explained, animals that would be known for their intelligence and temperament as well as their strength. He spoke of it with such passion that Octavia could picture it clearly, could imagine herself standing beside him as he worked with the horses, could see the kind of life they might build together. Octavia shared her own dreams of establishing a school that would serve the scattered families throughout the region. She envisioned a curriculum that would be practical as well as academic, teaching children not only reading and arithmetic, but also the skills they would need to thrive in frontier life. She talked about writing textbooks that would be specifically designed for Western students, books that would use familiar examples rather than the Eastern-focused content of current primers. As winter gave way to early spring in 1884, their relationship deepened. They moved beyond the careful politeness of early courtship into something more substantial and real. They had their first disagreement over something trivial, discovered that they could argue respectfully, and then reconcile with honesty and humor. They learned each other's habits and quirks, their strengths and weaknesses. And with each passing week, Octavia became more certain that Dalton was the man she wanted to spend her life with. In April, nearly 8 months after they had met, Dalton arrived at the schoolhouse with a nervous energy Octavia had never seen in him before. They worked through the cleaning routine, but he seemed distracted, frequently starting conversations and then trailing off mid-sentence. "Is something wrong?" Octavia finally asked, setting down her broom and crossing to where he stood by the window. "No, nothing is wrong," Dalton assured her. "In fact, something is very right. I have news, Octavia. Good news, I hope." "Tell me," she urged, taking his hands in hers. "I have purchased land," Dalton said, his eyes bright with excitement. 20 acres about 30 miles east of here in the settlement of Pine Ridge. It is beautiful country, Octavia. Rolling hills, good grazing, a creek that runs year-round. The soil is excellent, and there is timber enough to build whatever structures I need. Dalton, that is wonderful, Octavia exclaimed. I am so happy for you. I hope you will be happy for us, Dalton said. He released her hands and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small wooden box. Octavia Wright, I love you. I have loved you since the evening I first walked into this schoolhouse and saw you preparing to clean it alone. I have loved you more with each passing week, and I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else. He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small sapphire set in it. This was my mother's ring, he said. It is not much, but it belonged to a woman of great strength and grace, and I can think of no one better to wear it than you. Will you marry me, Octavia? Will you come to Pine Ridge with me and help me build a life there? Octavia's vision blurred with tears. Yes, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, Dalton, I will marry you. I love you too. I have loved you for months, and I want nothing more than to build a life with you. Dalton slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that had been carefully restrained throughout their courtship, but which now flowed freely. Octavia returned his kiss with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressed close to his. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and grinning like fools. When? Octavia asked. When shall we marry? As soon as you can make arrangements, Dalton said. I know you will need to notify the school board and find a replacement teacher, but I am eager to begin our life together, Octavia. I have waited so long to find you, and now that I have, I do not want to wait any longer than necessary. Give me a month, Octavia said. I will write to the school board tomorrow and begin training whoever they hire to replace me. A month should be sufficient time to make all the necessary arrangements. A month it is, then, Dalton agreed. They spent the rest of the evening making plans. Dalton described the land he had purchased in greater detail, sketching rough diagrams of where he planned to build their house, where the barn and corrals would go, where they might plant a garden. Octavia listened with growing excitement, adding her own suggestions and ideas. What about the school? She asked. You mentioned there was a need for one in Pine Ridge. There is, Dalton confirmed. There are at least 15 families in the area now, most with children. They have been trying to organize a school for the past year, but have had no success finding a teacher willing to relocate to such a remote area. Well, they have one now, Octavia said with satisfaction. I will teach in Pine Ridge, Dalton. We will build a schoolhouse, and I will educate those children just as I have been educating the children here. Are you certain? Dalton asked. It will be harder than what you have been doing here, more isolated, more rustic. I am certain, Octavia assured him. This is what I have been dreaming of, Dalton, a chance to make a real difference in a growing community, and I will be doing it alongside the man I love. What could be better than that? Dalton pulled her close again, resting his chin on top of her head. I do not deserve you, he murmured. Yes, you do, Octavia said firmly. You deserve every happiness, Dalton, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it. The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Octavia wrote to the school board, tendering her resignation and explaining that she was to be married. To her relief, they were understanding, if disappointed. The board quickly hired a replacement, a young man fresh from Teachers College in San Francisco who arrived eager to take over the position. Octavia spent several days training her replacement, showing him the routines she had established, introducing him to each student individually, and explaining their particular strengths and challenges. She felt a pang of sadness as she prepared to leave the schoolhouse that had been such an important part of her life. But the excitement of what lay ahead overshadowed any regret. She also had to make arrangements for her few belongings and say goodbye to the people of Seattle who had become her friends. The woman who ran the general store threw a small party in her honor, and several parents of her students came to thank her for the care and education she had provided their children. Meanwhile, Dalton was making his own preparations. He gave notice at the ranch where he had worked, settling his accounts and gathering his possessions. He purchased supplies for their new life, including lumber for building, tools, seeds for planting, and basic household necessities. He also arranged for the transport of these supplies to Pine Ridge, a logistical challenge given the rough roads and distance. They decided to have a simple wedding ceremony in Seattle before traveling to Pine Ridge. Dalton wanted Octavia to be his wife before they embarked on their new life together, and she agreed wholeheartedly. They were married on a bright May morning in 1884 by a traveling preacher, with the general store proprietor and her husband serving as witnesses. Octavia wore a new dress of soft gray silk, the finest garment she had ever owned, purchased with the last of her savings. Dalton wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his face cleanly shaved. They spoke their vows in strong, clear voices, neither hesitating or faltering. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed Octavia with such tenderness that several of the witnesses wiped tears from their eyes. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house where Dalton had been staying, in a room that felt almost luxurious with its real bed and washstand and window overlooking the street. Octavia had been nervous about the wedding night, as most young brides were, but Dalton was patient and gentle, taking his time to help her feel comfortable and cherished. Their lovemaking was sweet and passionate, a physical expression of the emotional bond they had been building for months. The next morning, they began their journey to Pine Ridge. They traveled in a sturdy wagon loaded with their belongings and supplies, pulled by 2 strong horses. Dalton drove while Octavia sat beside him, watching the landscape change as they left Seattle behind and headed east into more rugged country. The journey took 2 days, with an overnight stop at a way station that offered rough but clean accommodations. Octavia found herself excited rather than daunted by the primitive conditions. This was her new life, and she was ready to embrace it fully. When they finally arrived at Pine Ridge, Octavia's first impression was of open space and natural beauty. The settlement consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings scattered across a small valley, with farms and ranches spreading out into the surrounding hills. A general store served as the community center, and a blacksmith shop stood nearby. There was a small church building that doubled as a meeting hall, and several modest homes. Dalton's land was situated on a gentle slope overlooking the valley. As he had described, a creek ran through one corner of the property, its water clear and cold. Trees dotted the landscape, and the grass was already green with spring growth. "It is beautiful," Octavia breathed, taking in the view. "Oh, Dalton, it is absolutely beautiful." "I am glad you think so," Dalton said, relief evident in his voice, "because this is home now." They spent the first week living in a tent while Dalton began construction on their house. Several neighbors came to help, and Octavia was touched by their generosity. These were hardworking people who understood the value of community, who knew that helping others meant they would be helped in return when the need arose. The women of Pine Ridge welcomed Octavia warmly, bringing food and household items to help her set up housekeeping. They were thrilled to learn she was a teacher and immediately began discussing plans for a school. "We have been desperate for a proper school," explained Martha Henderson, a woman about Octavia's age with 3 children. "We have been trying to teach our children ourselves, but none of us have formal training. The older children can read a little and cipher some, but the younger ones are getting almost no education at all. Then, we will remedy that as soon as possible," Octavia assured her. "Once my husband and I are settled in our own home, I will begin organizing a school. Do you have a building we could use, or will we need to construct one?" "The church building could serve for now," suggested another woman. "It is not used every day, and it would accommodate all the children easily. Eventually, we hope to build a proper schoolhouse, but that would require raising funds. The church building will work perfectly to start," Octavia said. "I have some supplies I brought with me, and I can order more through the general store. If the families can provide slates and basic materials for their children, we can begin instruction within the month." The women were delighted, and word spread quickly through the small community. Parents began approaching Octavia to discuss their children's educational needs, and she found herself making mental notes about how to organize students of varying ages and abilities. Meanwhile, Dalton worked tirelessly on their house. He had help from neighboring men, but he insisted on doing much of the work himself, wanting their home to be built by his own hands. Octavia watched with admiration as the structure took shape, a modest but sturdy house with 2 rooms below and a loft above. When she was not helping Dalton or socializing with the women of Pine Ridge, Octavia worked on organizing the school. She inventoried her supplies, drafted a curriculum, and made plans for how to structure the school day. She also began working on her own textbook, using the journal Dalton had given her to draft lessons that would be relevant to the children of Pine Ridge. In late June, their house was finished enough to move into. It lacked some finishing touches, but it had a solid roof, sturdy walls, and a good fireplace. Octavia arranged their few pieces of furniture, hung curtains she had sewn herself, and created a home that was simple but welcoming. That first night in their own home, lying beside Dalton in the bed he had built with his own hands, Octavia felt a profound sense of contentment. She had never imagined she could be this happy, this satisfied with her life and circumstances. "Are you content?" Dalton asked softly, as though reading her thoughts. "I am more than content," Octavia replied. "I am joyful, Dalton. You have given me everything I ever wanted. A home, meaningful work, and most importantly, a partner who understands and supports me." "You have given me the same," Dalton said, pulling her close. "I was content with my life before I met you, but I did not know what I was missing. You have shown me that life can be more than just work and survival. You have shown me what it means to share your life with someone you love." They made love slowly and tenderly, celebrating their new home and their new life together. Afterward, they lay awake talking late into the night, making plans for the future, dreaming about the life they would build in Pine Ridge. In July, Octavia opened her school in the church building. 18 students attended the first day, ranging in age from 5 to 14. She organized them into groups by ability rather than age, a method she had found effective in Seattle. The youngest children focused on learning their letters and basic arithmetic, while the oldest worked on more advanced reading comprehension and mathematical problems. Teaching in Pine Ridge was different from teaching in Seattle. The children here had varied levels of prior education, from none at all to fairly advanced. Many had responsibilities at home that sometimes kept them from attending regularly. But they were eager to learn, and their parents were deeply appreciative of Octavia's efforts. Dalton, meanwhile, was building his horse ranch. He had purchased several mares and a good stallion, and he was beginning to develop a reputation for training quality animals. Men from throughout the region began coming to him for horses, and he found himself with more work than he could easily handle. In the evenings, Dalton would often come to the church to help Octavia clean up after the school day, just as he had done in Seattle. Sometimes he would arrive early and sit in the back, watching her teach, admiring her skill and dedication. Other times he would arrive just as the last student was leaving, ready to sweep and straighten while Octavia organized materials for the next day. "You are still cleaning the schoolhouse every evening," Dalton observed one night as they worked together, "and I am still helping you. And you are still learning about devotion," Octavia teased gently. "I learned that lesson long ago," Dalton said, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. "You taught me what it means to give of yourself fully, to commit to something not because it is easy or rewarding, but because it is important. You taught me that devotion is not grand gestures but daily choices, small acts of service performed consistently over time." "You taught me the same," Octavia said, resting her head against his chest. "You showed me that devotion means seeing someone's need and meeting it without being asked. You showed me that love is expressed through actions as much as words." They stood together in the quiet schoolhouse, holding each other close, grateful for the unexpected path that had brought them together. As autumn approached, Octavia discovered she was pregnant. She shared the news with Dalton on a cool September evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the valley. "I am going to have a baby," she said simply. Dalton turned to her, his eyes wide with wonder. "Truly, truly. The baby should arrive in early spring." Dalton let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests to be careful. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Octavia asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to describe it," Dalton said. "Octavia, you have made me the most fortunate man alive. A beautiful wife, a successful business, and now a child on the way." "How did I get so blessed?" "We blessed each other," Octavia corrected gently. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and winter. Octavia continued teaching as long as she was able, finally taking a break in late February when her condition made it too difficult to manage the schoolhouse duties. Several of the older students took turns helping maintain the school in her absence, a testament to the lessons in responsibility and community service she had been teaching them. On a bright March morning in 1885, with the help of Martha Henderson, who had considerable experience with births, Octavia delivered a healthy baby boy. Dalton was beside himself with joy, holding his son with such tender care that Octavia felt tears stream down her face. "What shall we name him?" Dalton asked, unable to take his eyes off the tiny face. "I would like to name him Daniel after your father," Octavia said. "If that would please you." Dalton looked up at her, his own eyes wet with tears. "It would please me more than I can say. Daniel Zimmerman. It is a strong name for what I am certain will be a strong man." Little Daniel thrived, growing healthy and alert. Octavia took a few months away from teaching to care for him, but by summer she had returned to the schoolhouse, bringing Daniel with her in a cradle that Dalton had built. The students were fascinated by the baby, and the older girls would often help watch him while Octavia taught. Life in Pine Ridge settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dalton's horse business continued to grow, and he hired a young man to help with the work. This allowed him more time at home with Octavia and Daniel, and he treasured every moment he could spend with his small family. The community continued to grow as well. More families arrived, attracted by the good land and the welcoming atmosphere. The school expanded, eventually outgrowing the church building. In the spring of 1886, the community came together to build a proper schoolhouse, a structure larger and more sophisticated than what they had been using. Octavia was deeply moved by this gesture. At the dedication ceremony, with Daniel on her hip and Dalton by her side, she addressed the assembled community. "When I first came west, I was looking for an opportunity to make a difference through teaching," she said. "I found that in Seattle, but I found so much more here in Pine Ridge. I found a community that values education and is willing to work together to provide it for their children. I found purpose and meaning in my work. But most importantly, I found love and family. My husband taught me what devotion truly means when he first came to help me clean the schoolhouse in Seattle, evening after evening, simply because he saw that the work needed to be done. He has continued to show me that devotion every day since. And you have all shown me what community devotion looks like, coming together to build this beautiful schoolhouse for our children. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." The community applauded, and several women wiped tears from their eyes. Dalton squeezed Octavia's hand, his face shining with pride. Over the next several years, their family grew. A daughter named Clara was born in 1887, followed by another son, Thomas, in 1889. Their home expanded to accommodate the growing family, and their lives became rich with the chaos and joy that children bring. Dalton's ranch became one of the most respected in the region. He specialized in training horses that were intelligent and calm, perfect for families and ranchers who needed reliable mounts. His reputation spread, and people came from miles around to purchase his horses. Octavia's school became the heart of the Pine Ridge community. She eventually published the textbook she had been working on, a primer specifically designed for children in frontier communities. It was adopted by several other small schools throughout Washington Territory, and later in the state of Washington after it achieved statehood in 1889. As their children grew, Octavia taught each of them herself, using the schoolhouse as their classroom along with the other community children. Daniel proved to have his father's affinity for horses and his mother's love of learning. Clara was artistic and gentle, with a gift for music that surprised both parents. Thomas was adventurous and curious, always exploring and asking endless questions. In the evenings after the children were in bed, Octavia and Dalton would often sit together on their porch, looking out over the land they had built their life upon. They would talk about their day, share their hopes and concerns, and simply enjoy each other's company. "Do you remember the first night you came to help me clean the schoolhouse?" Octavia asked one such evening in the summer of 1895, more than 10 years after they had first met. "Of course I do," Dalton replied. "I remember seeing the lamplight and thinking about you working alone. I remember walking up those steps not knowing if you would welcome my help or send me away." "I nearly did send you away," Octavia admitted. "I was not certain of your motives. But you gave me a chance," Dalton said, "and that chance changed my entire life." "It changed mine as well," Octavia said softly. "You taught me what it means to have a true partner, someone who sees work that needs doing and simply does it. Someone who shows his love not just through words but through consistent, daily actions." "I learned that from watching you," Dalton insisted. "You showed me what devotion looks like. The way you cared for that schoolhouse and those students, even when no one was watching or appreciating your efforts. The way you give of yourself completely to your work, to our children, to me. That is devotion, Octavia. That is love made visible." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch. Horses nickered softly in the barn, crickets chirped in the grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its mate. "I am grateful every day that I rode past that schoolhouse," Dalton said. "Grateful that I had the courage to walk through that door and offer my help. Grateful that you accepted." "As am I," Octavia said, reaching for his hand. "We have built a good life together, Dalton. A life full of purpose and meaning and love." "The best life," Dalton agreed. "And it is not over yet. We have many more years ahead of us, many more evenings sitting on this porch, many more adventures with our children and eventually grandchildren." Octavia smiled, imagining that future. Daniel was already 15, nearly grown, and showing interest in a young woman whose family had recently moved to the area. It would not be many years before he might marry and start his own family. Clara and Thomas were still young, but they too would grow and find their own paths. As the years continued to pass, Octavia and Dalton's devotion to each other and their community never wavered. They faced challenges together, supporting each other through difficult times and celebrating together during moments of joy. The Pine Ridge School continued to thrive under Octavia's leadership, eventually requiring a second teacher as the community grew. Dalton's ranch became one of the largest in the region, and he took great pride in training their sons in the work. When Daniel married at age 21, Octavia and Dalton became grandparents to a lively little girl named Rose. They doted on their grandchild, and Octavia found new joy in this different role. Clara followed her mother into teaching, taking over some of the younger students while Octavia focused on the advanced classes. Thomas decided to pursue veterinary medicine, a relatively new field, and left Pine Ridge to study in the East, though he promised to return and serve the ranching community. Through all these changes and transitions, the evening ritual that had brought Octavia and Dalton together remained important to them. Even as the school expanded and had hired help for maintenance, Octavia and Dalton would often walk to the schoolhouse together in the evening, straightening desks and organizing materials, talking about their day and their dreams. "We are getting old," Octavia observed one evening in 1903. She was 42 now and Dalton was 47. Their hair was streaked with gray and their faces bore the lines of lives fully lived. "We are getting old together," Dalton corrected. "There is a difference." "There is indeed," Octavia agreed. She looked around the schoolhouse, so much larger and more sophisticated than the simple one-room building in Seattle where their story had begun. "Do you ever think about that first schoolhouse? The one where we met?" "Often," Dalton admitted. "I think about the woman I saw through the window, working alone by lamplight. I think about gathering the courage to walk through that door and offer my help. I think about how that one decision changed everything." "It was the same for me," Octavia said. "When I decided to accept your help, to let you into my world, I had no idea I was letting in the man who would become my entire world." They finished their work and walked slowly home through the warm summer evening. Their children were grown or nearly so, their grandchildren were increasing, and their life together had been full of more blessings than either had dared to dream of in those early days. As they climbed the steps to their porch, Dalton paused and turned to Octavia. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Octavia asked. "For accepting my help that first evening, for giving me a chance, for teaching me what devotion truly means, for building this life with me, for everything." Octavia reached up and cupped his weathered face in her hands. "Thank you for seeing me when I thought I was invisible, for valuing my work when others took it for granted, for loving me so completely that I never doubted my worth, for being my partner in all things." They kissed on the porch of the home they had built together, surrounded by the land they had cultivated, secure in the love they had nurtured for nearly 20 years. It was not a passionate kiss of early romance, but something deeper and more profound. A kiss that spoke of decades of shared experience, of challenges overcome together, of love that had been tested and proven true. The years continued to unfold with their share of both joy and sorrow. They lost friends to illness and age, watched their children face their own challenges, and navigated the changes that came to Pine Ridge as it evolved from a frontier settlement into an established town. Through it all, Octavia and Dalton remained constants for each other, their devotion never faltering. When Thomas returned from his studies in 1905, he brought with him not only a veterinary degree, but also a wife, a kind young woman named Elizabeth who quickly became part of the family. The young couple settled in Pine Ridge, and Thomas established a practice that served the ranchers and farmers throughout the region. Dalton was particularly pleased to have his son nearby, and the two men worked together frequently, combining their knowledge of horses with Thomas's medical training. Clara married a young teacher who had come to assist at the school, and they eventually moved to Seattle where they established their own school. Octavia missed her daughter terribly, but was proud of the work she was doing, carrying on the family tradition of dedication to education. Daniel took over much of the day-to-day operation of the ranch, as Dalton gradually stepped back from the most physically demanding work. Father and son worked together seamlessly, and Dalton took deep satisfaction in seeing his eldest son manage the business he had built from nothing. In 1910, Octavia finally retired from teaching at the age of 49. She had educated hundreds of children over the course of her career, and many of them had gone on to become teachers, doctors, businesspeople, and leaders in their communities. At her retirement celebration, former students came from across the state to honor her, sharing stories of how she had influenced their lives. "Miss Wright, Mrs. Zimmerman, taught me more than reading and arithmetic," said one former student who was now a banker in Seattle. "She taught me the value of dedication and hard work. She showed me that anything worth doing is worth doing well, and that lesson has guided me throughout my life." Another student, now a doctor, added, "Mrs. Zimmerman never gave up on any of us. Even the students who struggled, she worked with them patiently until they understood. She believed in us when we did not believe in ourselves." Octavia was moved to tears by these testimonials, and Dalton stood beside her with his arm around her waist, beaming with pride. This was the fruit of her devotion, the visible proof that her life's work had mattered. In retirement, Octavia found new ways to contribute to the community. She mentored young teachers, wrote articles about education for regional publications, and continued work on additional textbooks. She also finally had time to pursue hobbies she had long neglected, taking up painting and finding she had a talent for capturing the landscapes she loved. Dalton continued working with horses well into his 60s, though he left the more strenuous work to Daniel and the hired hands. He took particular pleasure in training horses for his grandchildren, making sure each child had a gentle mount suited to their temperament and skill level. The grandchildren multiplied over the years. Daniel and his wife had 5 children in total. Clara had 3, and Thomas and Elizabeth had 4. Octavia and Dalton's home became the gathering place for family celebrations, filled with noise and chaos and love. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, their children organized a large celebration. Friends and family came from across the state, filling the church building that had once served as Octavia's first school in Pine Ridge. The walls were decorated with flowers, and a feast was laid out that would feed the entire community. When called upon to speak, Dalton stood with Octavia beside him, looking out at the assembled crowd. "30 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I have ever known," he began. But the truth is, I fell in love with her even before that, on an evening when I walked into a schoolhouse and saw her preparing to clean it alone. I offered to help her that night, not knowing it would be the most important decision of my life. He turned to look at Octavia, his eyes soft with love. She taught me what devotion means, not through words but through actions, through the daily choice to give of herself completely to her work and to the people she cares for. I have spent 30 years trying to match that devotion, to be worthy of the gift she gave me when she agreed to be my wife. I hope I have succeeded, at least in part. Octavia stood and took his hand. "You have more than succeeded," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "You have shown me every day what it means to be loved completely, to have a partner who sees you and values you and supports you in all things. When you first came to help me clean that schoolhouse, you said you wanted to learn about devotion. But Dalton, you taught me just as much as I taught you. You showed me that devotion is not a burden but a joy, that giving of yourself to someone you love is not a sacrifice but a privilege." She looked out at their assembled family and friends. "We have built a good life together, my husband and I. We have raised fine children, contributed to this community we love, and created something lasting. But more than any of that, we have loved each other with complete devotion for 30 years, and that is the greatest achievement of all." The room erupted in applause, and their children came forward to embrace them both. It was a moment of perfect happiness, the kind that Octavia treasured and held close to her heart. The years that followed brought the inevitable challenges of aging. Dalton's joints began to ache with arthritis, making the ranch work increasingly difficult. Octavia's eyesight weakened, forcing her to give up the detailed work of writing and painting. But they faced these changes together, adapting their lives as necessary, never complaining about what they had lost, but remaining grateful for what they still had. They spent more time sitting on their porch, watching the comings and goings of the ranch, observing their grandchildren grow and begin to have children of their own. They talked for hours, never running out of things to say to each other, their conversation as easy and natural as it had been from the beginning. "You have any regrets?" Octavia asked Dalton one evening in the summer of 1920. They were both in their 60s now, gray-haired and weathered but still strong in the ways that mattered most. Dalton considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret that I did not meet you sooner," he said finally. "I wish we had had even more years together, but other than that, no. I would not change a single thing about our life together." "Nor would I," Octavia agreed. "Except perhaps I would have accepted your help that first evening with more grace and less suspicion." Dalton laughed. "You had every right to be suspicious. A strange man appearing at your schoolhouse after hours could have meant trouble. But you were not trouble," Octavia said. "You were the answer to prayers I had not yet learned to pray." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and pink. In the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing, their laughter carried on the evening breeze. It was a sound that filled Octavia with profound contentment. As the 1920s progressed, Octavia and Dalton gradually took on the role of family elders. Their children and grandchildren sought their advice on matters large and small, and they dispensed wisdom gained from decades of life experience. They attended school recitals and church services, family dinners and community celebrations. They watched Pine Ridge continue to grow and change, adapting to new technologies and ideas while maintaining the strong sense of community that had always defined it. The schoolhouse where Octavia had taught for so many years was expanded again, eventually becoming a proper school with multiple classrooms and several teachers. but a plaque was placed in the original building, now used as a library, honoring Octavia Wright Zimmerman as the founder of education in Pine Ridge. She was embarrassed by the recognition but secretly pleased that her work would be remembered. Dalton's ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's management, though Dalton still visited the barns and corrals daily, unable to fully relinquish his connection to the horses he loved. The chestnut mare he had ridden when he first came to Seattle was long gone, but her descendants populated the ranch, a living legacy of his dedication to breeding quality animals. In the spring of 1925, Octavia and Dalton celebrated their 41st wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, just the two of them. Their children had offered to organize a celebration, but they had declined, preferring to spend the evening in each other's company. 41 years, Octavia marveled as they sat at the table Dalton had built with his own hands so many years ago. It seems like both forever and no time at all. It has been the best 41 years of my life, Dalton said. Every single one of them, even the difficult years. Octavia asked. The years when money was tight, when the children were sick, when we faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. Especially those years, Dalton insisted. Because those were the years when our devotion to each other was tested and proven true. Anyone can love when times are easy. The measure of real love, real devotion, is how you face adversity together. Octavia reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become second nature over 4 decades. We have faced everything together, she said. And we will continue to do so, for as many years as we are given. And so they did. They continued to sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the land they had built their life upon. They continued to attend church services and community gatherings, remaining active participants in the life of Pine Ridge. They continued to welcome grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren into their home, sharing stories of the old days and offering wisdom gleaned from a lifetime of experience. When Octavia was 71 and Dalton was 75, they took a journey back to Seattle, the city where they had met. The town had grown into a proper city now, barely recognizable from the rough frontier settlement it had been in the 1880s. The schoolhouse where Octavia had taught was no longer standing, replaced by a large brick building that served as an elementary school. But they stood on the site where the old schoolhouse had been, holding hands and remembering. This is where it all began, Octavia said softly. This is where you walked through that door and offered to help me clean. This is where I fell in love with you, Dalton said, though I did not realize it at the time. When did you realize it? Octavia asked, curious. They had been married for nearly 50 years, but there were still things they had never discussed. The second evening, Dalton admitted. When you shared your dreams with me, when you talked about your mother and your reasons for teaching. I looked at you standing in that schoolhouse, your face lit by lamplight, your voice full of passion for your work, and I thought, this is the woman I want to spend my life with. I fell in love with you the same night, Octavia confessed. When you listened to me talk about teaching without dismissing it as women's work, when you asked thoughtful questions and showed genuine interest, when I realized you valued my work as much as I did, that was the moment I began to love you. They returned to Pine Ridge with hearts full of gratitude for the path their lives had taken. The journey had required them to rest more frequently than they once would have, a reminder that they were no longer young, but they arrived home safely and were greeted with joy by their family. The years continued to pass with increasing speed. Birthdays and anniversaries came and went, marked with family gatherings and quiet celebrations. Great-grandchildren multiplied, and Octavia and Dalton found themselves at the center of a family tree that had grown large and strong. On a warm evening in June of 1932, Octavia and Dalton sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. She was 71, and he was 76. Their hair was white now, their bodies bearing the marks of long lives fully lived. But their love for each other had never dimmed, their devotion as strong as it had been on that first evening in a Seattle schoolhouse nearly half a century earlier. "You remember what you told me once about devotion?" Octavia asked, her hand resting in his. "You said it was not grand gestures but daily choices, small acts of service performed consistently over time." "I remember," Dalton said. "You have shown me that devotion every day for 48 years, Octavia continued. "From the first evening you helped me clean that schoolhouse to this very moment. You have been my partner, my support, my great love. Thank you, Dalton, for a life beyond anything I could have imagined." "The thanks are mine to give," Dalton replied. "You gave me purpose and meaning. You showed me what it meant to dedicate yourself completely to something worthwhile. You made me want to be a better man, and you loved me even when I fell short. There is no gift greater than that." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Around them, the ranch was quiet, the evening peaceful. Their children were grown and thriving, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren scattered across the state, but connected by the strong bonds of family that Octavia and Dalton had forged. It was a life well lived, a love well earned, a devotion proven through decades of daily choices and small acts of service. It had begun in a schoolhouse with a cowboy offering to help with the evening cleaning, and it had grown into something beautiful and lasting, a legacy that would continue through the generations of family they had created. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast sky above Pine Ridge, Octavia leaned her head against Dalton's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. Neither spoke, but no words were necessary. Everything that needed to be said had been said through a lifetime of actions, through devotion demonstrated day after day, year after year. They had found each other in a schoolhouse, two people looking for something they could not quite name. She had been cleaning, preparing for the next day's students with quiet dedication. He had stopped to help, offering his time and labor freely. And in that simple exchange, they had discovered love, partnership, and a devotion that would sustain them through nearly 5 decades of life together. It was, they both agreed, the best decision either of them had ever made.